Hey guys, what's going on? This is BBZ for BBZ Staking, and today we've got more hands from Pluribus. So for those that checked out that first video, today is a follow-up. For those that missed the first video, I'm going to explain really quickly what Pluribus is, and then we're going to get into some action. So Pluribus is an AI built by Carnegie Mellon University, CMU, and Facebook to compete effectively against human players. They built that AI using a self-iterative blueprint, basically through a process called Monte Carlo counterfactual regret. Basically just played against itself a lot and refined its strategy over time. And so what we've got is we've got an outside perspective on how an AI would approach no limit hold'em, and I think that's really interesting, particularly for the high stakes community. And so we're going to take a look at 3 of those hands today. First, I really appreciate the guys that took the time to watch that first video and then head over to BBZCoaching.com. The feedback there has been great, and so I really appreciate that. And so let's get into some of these hands, and we'll see how Pluribus is approaching some of these spots. These 3 spots in particular are some huge bluffs that Pluribus pulled. Some really interesting spots from my perspective. Hopefully you guys find these interesting. So with that, we start with Pluribus raising the button with Queen Jack suited, very standard, and we start with a human player 3-betting his big blind with 9-7 suited, also fairly standard. And Pluribus defends its range by calling. I think with Queen Jack suited, that's the best play to make in a very high frequency line for the high stakes metagame at the moment. So I don't think anyone's doing too much differently so far in either player's shoes. Mr. Blonde elects to check the flop, and Pluribus starts with a bet. And so I think from Mr. Blonde's perspective, this is not the flop you would have asked for. I think that checking the flop about a third or so of the time is reasonable. I think he's still going to have a high frequency bet with his most efficient 3-bets on this type of a flop. So hands like 9s and 10s and jacks, probably high frequency c-bet, but can mix check at the margin. And then he's going to have some other hands and some duplicative effects around his betting range and things. So okay, Pluribus bets, and I think from Pluribus's perspective, this is a flop that doesn't interact well with a 3-better's range, and Queen Jack suited has reasonable blocking effects and is going to be a hand that high frequency bets this flop. I think the metagame of high stakes players would mostly have bet this flop in Pluribus's shoes. So far I think this hand is being played pretty standard on both sides. And Mr. Blonde starts with a call. Again, very, very standard, and I don't think anyone's doing anything differently at a high frequency in the high stakes community so far. Mr. Blonde checks the turn on the 4 of hearts. Again, very standard. I don't think high frequency lead on this card for Mr. Blonde. And so the action falls to Pluribus. And I think Pluribus, this is a pretty good card for Pluribus. It doesn't interact with the weaker parts of Mr. Blonde's flop check calling range, like ace king or ace queen, for example. And so I think that this is as far as turns go, it's not a bad one. I think it's a reasonably high frequency bet for Pluribus with it from the perspective of Pluribus's range. Now, when we look at Pluribus's hand, I think Queen Jack in general should bet often, but I don't really like it with clubs given the blocker effects around backdoor flush draws and the way that those mechanics work. I don't think this hand should pure check. But I think something like a 15 to 25% bet with this exact Queen Jack might be appropriate, and the rest of the time you would check. I don't think this hand is a high frequency bet, but Pluribus does find the bet, and I think that's one of the reasons why I thought this was interesting. So we don't get to know the weights that Pluribus is taking this line, but certainly this is a lower frequency bet for me given suits. Mr. Blonde check calls the turn, and I think that's also very standard. So we catch the 10 of diamonds on the river, and Mr. Blonde checks again for a 3rd time. I think really the only way to play the hand from like a majority perspective for Mr. Blonde, I think this is going to be the highest frequency line for Mr. Blonde when he gets dealt this hand and takes this and 3-bets pre-flop. So I have no disagreement so far with Mr. Blonde's action. I think from Pluribus's perspective, this is one of those hands that probably pure shoves the river. So every single time that we have this hand in this type of a scenario, we should probably be all in. And that's because we unblock spades. We don't block bluffs at all, really, that would have check called the turn. This is a great hand to bluff with from the perspective of Pluribus. And so I really want to see Pluribus just rip it, which it does. And so that's great to see. And unfortunately, Mr. Blonde folds, which I don't think is a high frequency play. So our human counterpart here misses a call, in my opinion. I think when you're evaluating this type of a situation, a hand like 9-7 has really good blocking effects around a number of value bets, Jack 9, 10-9 suited, sets, etc., 7-8 suited. And so I don't think that Mr. Blonde's fold, given the bet sizes in play, is a thing, really. So I think he should have called. I think he made a mistake. And I think, Pluribus played his hand perfectly from my perspective, with the exception of that turn bet, which I think for me is a lower frequency line. But again, not zero. So I think Mr. Blonde's line on the river gets close to zero. I don't think you really want to fold that hand here. So with that, we have our second hand. And Mr. Blonde is the hero again. And, trying to represent the humans. And Mr. Blonde opens Jack 9 suited. I think that's pretty standard. And Pluribus defends King 10 suited by calling. It could have 3-bet. I think it's a mix, but it defends this time by calling. That's fine. Pluribus starts by checking. I think that's the go-to line for everyone, pretty much, in this type of a scenario. There are a lot of asymmetries on a flop like this that belong to Mr. Blonde. Around pocket queens, jacks, 10s, and ace-king. I think those hands will mix 3-bet for Pluribus, and at the same time, Pluribus has a wider range than Mr. Blonde does. So there's some asymmetry there, given Mr. Blonde's narrower starting range and higher density around some of those hands. So Mr. Blonde should probably be betting his entire range here. He can probably deploy a number of sizings, some of them very large. But I don't think check should be a part, and certainly not a meaningful part, of Mr. Blonde's strategy. But he checks. So far, Mr. Blonde is not so impressive, in my opinion. All right, we catch the 7 of hearts turn, and Pluribus follows up with check, which I think is the only really reasonable answer in Pluribus's spot. You may, have some spider senses going off as a human when someone checks a flop like the one that we have here, because Mr. Blonde really shouldn't have had a checking range at all. But when he does check, I think checking twice is appropriate for the most part. I don't think you're going to bet very often. Mr. Blonde's range shouldn't include many bluffs, and it should probably be a lot of hands like the one he has. So betting a pair of 10s here doesn't make much sense from Pluribus's perspective. I do think Mr. Blonde should check twice, which he does, and that's good to see, because I don't think he should follow up by reopening the action here, considering he would always have bet the flop with really strong hands, presumably. So I do think checking twice is appropriate for Mr. Blonde. And Pluribus checks the river, which I think is the only play for Pluribus. I don't like reopening the action, opening to a bet on the river here. I don't think it accomplishes anything productive, and I think Pluribus should just check. Once Pluribus checks, I think Mr. Blonde should also check. And the reason I think Mr. Blonde should also check is kind of complicated, but it mostly involves asymmetry around the nuts still belonging to Pluribus, and the fact that I just don't see this bet as being very productive. In spite of that, I think that against this bet, when Mr. Blonde makes this bet, I think Pluribus should mix call and raise. I don't think Pluribus should fold this hand at all, and some of you might wonder why, if I think this hand is a call, why I wouldn't bet as Mr. Blonde. That's going to take a longer time to explain than we have in this video, but I don't think that Mr. Blonde should bet his hand, and I still think Pluribus should call or raise. And Pluribus does elect to raise. Pluribus elects to raise to a pretty large sizing, 2,700, when the total pot after the raise is 3,600. So Pluribus needs to win this hand 75% of the time when it makes this bet, which is a pretty high frequency. So Mr. Blonde needs to find a way to defend 25% of his range. I think the way that Mr. Blonde finds the nuts is probably with Queen 10 on occasion. I think alternatively, the way that Mr. Blonde might find some calls is with a hand like pocket kings or something. Again, I think medium strength hands are the types of hands that Mr. Blonde might check on the flop. But Mr. Blonde really shouldn't have checked the flop, right? So his exact range construction is a bit of a mystery. And yeah, I mean, I like Pluribus's raise size, and Mr. Blonde gets outplayed and outworked by Pluribus after folding the best hand in a scenario where Mr. Blonde pretty much made a mistake on the both meaningful streets. The turn play was fine, but Mr. Blonde so far has been a disappointment to the human team when we're competing with AI. And so now we have Pluribus playing a hand in a pretty standard way again, being dealt king 3 of clubs, defending pre-flop, and checking the flop from the big blind. I think very, very standard so far. Both players check as in position, and I think that's standard given the hands at play. Mr. Blonde ends up betting the turn to half pot. I think potentially a non-zero line, but not a high frequency play with pocket fours. So I'm not going to say it's a mistake, but you know, I'm not going to do this all the time or anything either. And Pluribus selects to call, which I think is the only real. That's not true. I think Pluribus can mix fold with this hand, but I think calling often is still good. And then Pluribus checks the river on the 4 of diamonds, which I think is the only answer that Pluribus can really deploy here at a high frequency. And Mr. Blonde bets half pot again, which I think is interesting. I don't mind this bet size. I think it's reasonable. It allows Mr. Blonde to have a wide range of hands, and this bet size should encourage Pluribus to 2-bet 10x combos. So I don't mind Mr. Blonde's bet size here. And Pluribus takes the bait with a pretty reasonable blocker, I would say. I do think that this blocker. Sorry, guys, 1 second. I do think that this blocker is pretty reasonable on the part of Pluribus, and the reason for that is basically that pocket fours and pocket threes are going to be meaningful parts of Mr. Blonde's sort of nutted range. I think Mr. Blonde has a mixed weight bet on the flop with 10x. I do think Mr. Blonde can still have 10x. I think hands like 9s, 3s, and 4s make up a not unreasonable part of the nut component for Mr. Blonde here. And choosing to just mix weight raise a blocker from Pluribus's perspective is probably fine. The 3 is definitely relevant. It's helpful. It's not so relevant that you can do this every single time. It's probably a 15% play, but non-zero. And I think this bet size needs to work about 70% of the time against Mr. Blonde. And so Mr. Blonde needs to defend here about 30% of his range. Fortunately for Mr. Blonde, he's got pocket fours, and that simplifies things. And I do think given his bet size and Pluribus's likely 2-bet with a number of 10x combos, Mr. Blonde should find the 3-bet here, versus Pluribus. So I do like Mr. Blonde's line completely from start to finish in this hand. So Mr. Blonde did find the right answer all the way through, and unfortunately Pluribus has to fold. So with that, those are the 3 hands for today. I really appreciate you guys checking these out. I hope you guys follow up with us and check the Pluribus videos out on BBZCoaching.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, subscribe below for this YouTube video here. And thanks very much for checking for everything that you guys have done so far, supporting us and heading over to that website. I really appreciate it. It's been great. So thanks guys, and enjoy your day. Bye-bye.